Hello, you're listening to the Art History Symposium, brought to you by the University of California at Davis. With every episode, we'll bring you the latest in art historical research from faculty, students, and alumni of UC Davis. Before we begin with our fall 2009 season, we thought we'd play catch-up and introduce Lucinda White Frachtenberg. Lucinda received her MA in June of 2009. Her main area of research is in photography, with a focus on the late 20th century and issues of gender and representations of women. Her undergraduate studies consisted of photography as well as dance from the University of New Mexico. What you're about to hear is her thesis presentation, titled Ruptures in Truth, Thomas Eakins and the Pictorialist Vision. Enjoy.
Thomas Eakins is perhaps best known today as the painter of the Gross Clinic. His legacy has been shaped by his deep interest in science, and he has been said to epitomize, quote, the character of American art as it has been constructed, realist, uncompromising, independent, and masculine, unquote. Given Eakins' interest in both science and realism, it is not surprising that he was an avid amateur photographer who produced hundreds of photographs in the latter decades of the 19th century. What is surprising, however, is the visual qualities of these photographs. Photographs which indicate an aesthetic sensibility not commonly associated with Eakins as a painter. One might expect Eakins' photographic work to document modern life, or to look like the scientific photography of the time. Instead, his photography indicates a preoccupation with romanticized subject matter, including blurred landscapes and idealized nudes. Despite this visual evidence, Eakins' association with realism, his use of photography for painting studies, as well as his interest in scientific advances, continues to render most scholars blind to the possibility that Eakins' photography constituted a significant body of artistic practice. This research begins then with the question, what would it mean if Eakins' photographs were to be taken seriously as art? To answer this question, Eakins must be re-examined in light of the early American pictorialist movement. The art of painting, with all of its lingering associations with the traditional and its assumed connection to a subjective human experience, stood in the 19th century in opposition to photography's ability to objectively document the world. Photography was a product of modernity, which then returned images of modernity to an audience eager for evidence of its own progress. In a rejection of this, the Pictorialists sought to suppress photography's association with the mechanical process by making photographs that looked more like paintings. Pictorialism can most broadly be defined as the attempt to claim artistic legitimacy in photography by refusing to make forefront all the veracity which photography naturally excelled at. In many ways, pictorialism represented a negating set of rules and beliefs that belied the very features which made photography a unique medium, and instead attempted to connect photography to the history and the rules of fine art. Although Eakins' photographs hold obvious visual parallels to pictorialism, the connection between Eakins' photography and the pictorialist vision is a surprising one, given Eakins' apparent ideological commitments. However, photography seems to have allowed Eakins a place to explore an imaginative, expressive romanticism that his paintings do not address. That contradiction, that a scientific medium would allow a realist artist a place to be less concerned with realism, is the focus of this research. And here I show you some examples of Eakins' photography. He produced such a large body of work that it's impossible for me to adequately address it in the scope of this talk. So I hope these images here will impart a better general sense of his visual aesthetic. Eakins, while obviously influenced by pictorialism, was using his visual aesthetic to somewhat different ends. I would suggest that Eakins did not position his photography in opposition to science, but rather used its mechanical properties to allow a free play of artistic concerns. This distinction between Eakins' point of view and pictorialism, while subtle, is nonetheless crucial for an understanding of him as a pictorialist photographer. My argument is supported by the research of Michael Leja, who in his book, Looking Askance, Skepticism and American Art from Eakins to Duchamp, discussed Eakins' use of realist principles and science in painting. definition of what constituted realism, Leger proposed that Eakins was trying to, quote, remake realism for a world of illusionism and deceptions, unquote. Leger points to what he calls discordances in Eakins' paintings to support his claim that Eakins was committed to both scientific truth and artistic truth, truths which do not always agree. Leger then states that the scientific knowledge sought after by Eakins was actually an obstacle to his realism, and that Eakins constantly fought with the limits of the seen world and his desire to paint the truth. Leger makes the complex argument that Eakins' desire for realism, desire for scientific truth, and desire for artistic profundity were constantly juxtaposed in his paintings. This merging of differing sets of optical truths inserts ruptures into the paintings, ruptures between the scientific and the artistic. I suggest that these same optical ruptures are present and visible in Eakins' photographic work, and that although visually very different, Eakins grappled with similar issues in the photographic medium as in his painting. The ruptures in Eakins' photographs challenge both the mechanical and the aesthetic expectations of photography. In this way, Eakins enters a dialogue about art which questions truth, a dialogue fundamental to modernity and provoked by the camera. Out of the large collection of Eakins' photographic work, two particular subjects emerge as significant towards understanding the particular pictorialist vision of Thomas Eakins: the landscape and the nude. Landscape, although a little remarked upon portion of Eakins' photography, was a crucial genre for pictorialists. The landscape genre had immediate associations for a contemporaneous audience with painting and the popular sweeping vistas of the newly explored West, as well as scenes of East Coast wilderness, such as those by the Hudson River School. Early pictorialists used the association between landscape and painting to their advantage, attempting to show that photography could capture nature in similarly expressive and romantic terms. A photograph by John Moran from 1871 of the edge of a body of water between a pebbled bank and a background of mountains and sky demonstrates Moran creating a landscape photograph which could be compared favorably to a painting. As intentionally composed as a large-scale landscape painting, Moran employs a balance between foreground of earth, middle ground of water, and background of mountains and sky to give harmony to the image. A single arch of a branch caught in the water mimics the arch of the mountain in the background and creates a focal point for the composition as a whole. Additionally, Moran uses the mist rising off the water to lend his image an out-of-focus quality that would become a hallmark of the pictorialists. In contrast, although also carefully composed, an image by William Henry Jackson emphasizes detail and veracity. In this photograph, Jackson captures a lone train engine running between a cliff face and a body of water. The semicircle of the train track is elegant against the looming cliff, which dwarfs the engine. Images of the West, such as this one, often feature compositions which highlight both the presence of man's advances into nature and the technological aspects of photography by insisting on extreme levels of detail and crisp focus. The sharpness of this photograph is consistent from foreground to background, underscoring the machine-like perfection of both the railroad and the camera itself. In comparison to these two photographs, an early landscape photograph by Eakins shows an interest in composition, space, and pattern. An image of a grassy field snaked through with narrow loops of water and bisected at the top by a straight horizon line, this photograph achieves an unusual amount of flatness. The foreground pours down towards the viewer and takes 2/3 of the image space. The background, with its sharp horizon line and oddly straight row of trees, masks any sense of distance and depth. Eakins, even here in his early experimentation with the tools of photography, shows an awareness of shaping the final image rather than just capturing a scene. This creation of a landscape through manipulation of photography's formal properties could be said to lessen the accuracy of the scene and therefore be a part of the pictorialist vision. In contrast to Eakins' highly studied approach to painting, his photographs, while they cannot be removed from photography's insistence on a singular point of view, allow a different sort of looking. Unlike his paintings, which stress the formula of the grid and a fixed mathematical relationship of viewer to image, this landscape photograph confronts a viewer with the evidence of the real world, but one which refuses to conform to the idea of linear perspective. The most problematic of Eakins' photographs are those of the nude figure. While this genre is the most prolific of Eakins' body of photographic work, the motivations behind his nude studies have never been clear. Although nude photographs can suggest a relationship to pornography or erotic imagery, it is clear that Eakins' nudes were not pornographic and do not fit the conventional visual modes of erotic photography. His nudes rarely look at the camera and do not display the coyness or lewd postures associated with pornography. His nudes and landscapes are most often engaged in a quiet activity or a moment of their own. They are, however, visually distinct from the later Pictorialist nudes, which often use symbolic props or extreme softening of the image through manipulation of focus. In 3 Crowell Boys Nude, outdoors at Avondale, Pennsylvania, Eakins creates a photograph which prefigures a later Pictorialist image by Clarence H. White from 1905. Eakins' photograph suggests both the romantic sensibility of nude youth out in nature and also presents a realism that is absent in the later photograph by White. In Eakins' image, he placed his 3 young nephews outdoors. On the right, one boy leans against a tree branch with one knee propped up and his head down in the corner of his elbow. The 2 other boys stand on the left and turn away from the camera. All 3 are framed between 2 large trees, and a wooden fence is just visible in the distance. All 3 of the bodies have a solidity and a physicality that makes their nudity all the more uncomfortable for the viewer. In contrast, White's photograph removes all sense of time and place, allowing his youth to become a classical figure of Apollo or Adonis. White also posed a young boy outdoors, nude, and formed his composition by framing the figure between trees. The boy in the White photograph faces away from the camera, holding a bow and arrow above his head. The boy's entire body is stretched with suggested action, unlike Eakins' models that merely wait for the shutter release. There are no signs of a man-made environment in Boy with a Bow, unlike the suggestion of the fence in Eakins' photograph. White's model convincingly embodies a classical pose and blends into the nature he is placed in, his vertical posture mimicking that of the trees. The difference between these 2 photographs may be conveyed through the idea that, as Mary Panzer states, quote, Eakins did not believe that human beings required the improving hand of the artist to make them beautiful. He welcomed any image that offered an uncensored view of the human form. Unquote. In Eakins' photograph, we see the uncensored human bodies of these children, awkwardness included. He makes the viewer aware of the model's physicality through the fact of the body's effort and stillness. At the same time, however, this image embodies an aesthetic which I believe still connects to the Pictorialist ideals. Eakins clearly uses an artist's composition, placing the 3 figures within the space of the 2 trees, and contrasting the 2 straight bodies on the left against the curled one on the right. The connection of the nude form to nature itself is a Pictorialist motif, which Eakins prefigures. And although he does not romanticize the bodies themselves, he creates an image which tells us more about its maker than it does its subjects. Eakins' photograph of his 3 nephews, which in many ways appears Pictorialist, still does not attain the romanticism of the similar photograph by White from 2 decades later. In Eakins' photograph, although the subject matter remains one which Pictorialists embrace enthusiastically, the effect of the image is quite different, producing a discomfort that hinges on the obvious corporeality of the 3 boys. Unlike the White photograph, which assumes a mythical and otherworldly quality that is undisturbed, Eakins' photograph cannot hide the realism of its subjects, as romantic as the setting and poses may be. Eakins never lost a fascination with the mechanics of the body, even in his least scientific images, such as this one from approximately 1890. In this photograph, Eakins' wife, Susan, and his horse, Billy, stand together outdoors amid the leaves of small trees. Susan is shown nude with her back to us and her arms draped along Billy's neck. This photograph is startling in both its poetic and frank qualities. The body is rendered very clearly with attention to the spine and the muscles of the back. Susan Eakins is delicate against the solidity of the horse, with her scapula and deltoid creating a perfect triangular ring. And rendered in the black and white of photography, her skin tone and the coat of the horse become nearly the same tone of pale gray. In this photograph, Eakins makes an image of tenderness, tactility, and sensuality. He suggests connections between nature, animals, and women that are poetic in a way his paintings never were. His use of space and composition can be directly related to the ideas and work of the pictorialists. At the same time, this photograph refuses to be fully pictorialist and retains some amount of realism, acting, as Legia suggested, as a hybrid or a link between the differing optical truths of science and experience. Although the subject matter is consistent with pictorialism, the insistent physicality of the horse and the woman, without any softening of either the photograph itself or of the narrative, is a realist vision of the scene. As with many of Eakins' paintings, the realism here does not rely on exact replication, but rather on details, which directly engage the viewer with the challenge of seeing. The precise wing of Susan's scapula and the tactile sense of the horse's warmth both demand that the viewer perceive not only a lyrical nude, but also a real flesh and blood moment. Eakins, by using painting to explore realism and using photography to explore the expressive, switched the expected roles of these mediums. His project of using a mechanical process to access the romantic impulses is a parallel project to his painting, but also diametrically opposed. He was certainly, as Legia claims, refusing to be contained by a definition of either realism or any of its so-called oppositions. Perhaps, as Legia asserts, this refusal was not merely a contrarian reaction against traditional models, but an attempt to engage his viewers in his project of linking scientific truth to artistic truth. As Legia claims, Eakins's, quote, pictorial discrepancies and fractures, among other devices, positioned viewers outside the work and elicited a critical, analytical scrutiny, unquote. I believe that Eakins's photography similarly positions viewers to scrutinize their own expectations of visual truth. Eakins created photographs over and over again that are not merely scientific experiments or painting studies. He intentionally composed, arranged, and printed photographs which speak of a romanticism not associated with his definition as a realist painter. Eakins's realism can be understood to be a part of his photographs and indeed a part of his pictorialism, which implies the limitations of these categories altogether. His use of realism, science, and pictorialism is not lessened by their combination. Instead, it suggests Eakins's important grappling with the very notion of seeing itself. I suggest that Eakins began from the pictorialist vision, one which is inherently romantic and pointedly non-scientific,
Lucinda, thank you very much.
and then subtly undercut these very qualities with an eye to reveal.
So you're talking about
This contradiction, seen especially in light of his photographic work, marks Eakins as a harbinger of a disillusionment with modernity. His photographic romanticism, usually denied an important place in scholarship, can now be seen to signify a prescient engagement with the 20th century modernism's conflicted relationship to objective and subjective truths. Thank you.
His deep interest in his paintings and in his life with anatomy and medicine, and sort of revealing anatomy. Unlike the pictorialists, who often in their photography, the realness of the body is not an issue. The kind of fuzzy quality or creating a narrative of a mythical and supernatural world becomes forefront. So it was more in the landscapes, I guess, that I was thinking of the sort of the use of linear perspective and the way that, with his painting, landscape photographs, he is able to kind of move away from that and actually, use flatness or see other things. So I don't know if that quite answers it.
It gets there, so you're suggesting that while the landscapes and the nudes have certain factors in common, there are actually procedural distinctions between those two categories as well.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, I haven't actually thought, I'm sure I could address the sort of the use of the landscape within the nude photography and the linear perspective within those.
So even just, the pattern and geometry that's so routine in 19th century composition is still there.
Yeah.
Okay, thank
Something
you.
I'll have to keep looking into.
Yes.
I have a question also about the nudes and Thomas Eakins photography. I was interested in what you said about White's image of the boy with the bow when you were comparing it to the image of his three nephews. And you had said, I think you said that while White's young boy was like in motion and about to shoot the bow, Eakins' young boys were like waiting for the button to be pushed almost. And it's interesting because when we looked at those like figure studies that he took, all of those images were like humans in motion. And I was wondering if you thought maybe his pictorialist nudes would be specifically human figures like just waiting or something. I don't know what you thought. I just wanted to know.
Yeah, I mean, there does seem to be a distinction. Eakins was also involved in taking a lot of photographs that corresponded to his teaching at Pennsylvania Fine Art Academy, and so they were, studies of bodies' forms and studies for paintings, and many of those are in the real typical classical motion poses and showing the muscles work. While his more, what I'm calling pictorialist nude images do seem to contain this pervasive sort of stillness, the sense of the models waiting and posing instead of being in action. So yeah, there does seem to be, a specific aesthetic, response that he's having when he's making those nudes that is really distinct from the others.
Someone had a question.
Two questions. One is, what do we know about his darkroom technique? And what relation has he got to Gérôme and Gérôme's use of the photograph and his obsession with it?
Yeah, we don't know that much about his darkroom technique. Eakins really never exhibited his photographs publicly in his lifetime, so we don't know that much about his working methods. He did print some platinum photographs, though. In fact, the ones I showed, the nudes anyway, are platinum photographs, which indicate, a deeper knowledge of the process. And platinum processing is more in depth than just.
I was thinking of print states. You can tell from print states just what he's done. Has anybody done any work on this?
The state of the existing prints?
You photograph,
Yeah.
or the existing plate.
Yeah, I mean, his photographs have really been understudied. There's a large body of his work that wasn't actually sort of discovered or made public to scholars until 1985. And so since then, people have been looking at that, but there hasn't been a lot of work done, and in fact, the state of the prints itself has been used to say that he wasn't a serious photographer, because the prints were often small, and they weren't given titles or dates, and they were often torn or haphazard or not cataloged.
Are these contact prints?
Most of them are, yes. And a lot of them were found just as glass plate negatives also, and so then they've been made into modern prints. And as far as for the second question, he studied, Eakins studied with Gérôme in Paris, right about the time he was learning photography, most likely. So there is a connection there, certainly.
Does he mention in his correspondence or whatever any attachments that he had with Gérôme in this quarter? I mean, many people by mid-century were using the photograph all of the time.
Yeah.
So it's the same Paris especially, but also in London.
Yeah, I mean, he does mention Jerome a lot in his letters, but he doesn't mention learning to use the camera specifically. So.
Well, I just had a follow up on Seymour's question about the states of the prints. Have there been discovered the different versions of the prints? So you can see that the artist was trying to do a lighter, darker, working with different techniques, trying to burnish in, we could determine, or you could, not you, could determine, people like you could determine more his thought processes and choices for what he was trying to say.
Yeah, I think in general there doesn't seem to be a lot of evidence that he was particularly concerned with the kind of darkroom techniques and cropping images or doing all those things that the pictorialists then do all sorts, becomes really crucial for them. It seems like his relationship with photography was more about taking the images and then making these contact work prints and seeing them. But then because he never exhibited images, and so he kind of most often did not ever go beyond those kind of contact prints, with larger images or do further manipulations.
So do you think he just thought of them as sort of study works more than anything else?
Well, that has been the argument, to sort of not consider him as a photographer, basically. But I think that there are a couple things. I mean, one is just my general feeling that you don't have to be obsessed with the darkroom to be considered a photographer, and that his, just the glass plates left behind themselves, even ones that we don't know if they were ever printed, can still indicate a specific visual goal.
Yeah.
And two, we also know that many of his work, his photographs in particular, were destroyed when he died, because especially these nude images were considered sort of inappropriate or controversial, and he had already had issues in his lifetime getting in trouble for doing inappropriate things, that it's kind of known that his friends, when he died, took it upon themselves to help clean up his legacy and get rid of stuff.
Yeah.
So it could be that there is that evidence that was there and is now lost.
Well, I thought your paper was very convincing. I don't challenge it. I'm just increasingly curious now about this findings.
I had a question for Lucinda. I thought your talk was very interesting. It seems to be that you're suggesting that Eakins' photographs are a little more romantic and his paintings are a little more scientific, which is kind of the opposite of what we generally, associate paintings with romanticism and photographs with mechanical. So I was curious if you thought specifically about the photograph of his wife and the horse, if the sitters had anything to do with it, if he, if he's observing these things from nature that maybe he didn't have any intentions of planning out kind of this romanticism that ends up in, the absence of in his paintings.
Yeah, so maybe the thought that he was just documenting, observing and documenting instead of setting up.
Yeah, like how much maybe her influence, the model's influence had.
Yeah, I mean, that comes up too, because there are also a number of photographs which exist in which Eakins appears in the photograph also nude. And so then you get into the issue of, okay, well, who's the photographer then, right? If someone else is pressing the button, is he the kind of author of these or not? But I think that sort of that confusion aside, it seems to me that the nudes in particular are too deliberate, A, and B, too unusual for the time period to have not been set up, to not really be an aesthetic, I'm trying to create a specific vision, specific image. I mean, it seems to me like it'd be kind of unusual to go out for a picnic with your wife and for her to wind up naked with the horse. I don't know. It seems like he's directing that, like he is really making that image happen. There are some other nude
images where it is more just people laying around in grass, or maybe, but this is a really conservative time, kind of, Philadelphia was particularly a kind of conservative, area, and, he got in a lot of trouble for engaging with nudity with the students. So it seems that it must have been much more deliberate, really from him, really coming from his vision. Although it's hard to know how much, his wife was also an artist, and we don't know how much input she had, obviously.
To find out more information on the people and events affiliated with the Art History Symposium, please visit our website at www.ucdavis.edu/arthistory. You can also look us up on Facebook under Art History UC Davis. Your feedback and commentary is always welcome. This has been the Art History Symposium, brought to you by the University of California at Davis. Thanks for listening.